think it's Helen Joyce who talks about the importance of speaking out is that it lowers the cost of speaking out to the next person. And so I like to see this as the result of multiple people speaking out on this issue that finally made it possible for him to say, to break with the Democrats and the consensus on this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending in March 7th, 2025. We are here with Scott, Jose, Joss, and me, Arianne. First, a summary of the news. Iowa removes gender identity from its list of protected characteristics in civil rights law. Protests for women's sports are held in Maine. Glenna Goldis highlights fraud in the Washington Gender Clinic testimony. Study released that finds so-called gender-affirming surgery increases mental health problems. Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act fails in the Senate. A trial begins for a man who punched a female women's rights protester in Canada. A nude bathhouse in San Francisco is under fire for excluding trans-identified males from a women's-only night. And California Governor Gavin Newsom admits in his podcast that he finds males competing in female sports unfair. We'll start with you, Scott.
Thanks, Arianne. Iowa has voted to remove gender identity from its civil rights code, shifting the legal focus back to sex-based protections. Governor Kim Reynolds strongly supported this measure and signed it into law, making Iowa the first state to take this step. She emphasized the importance of maintaining clear legal definitions based on biological sex to ensure fairness and protect women's rights. This move responds to concerns that gender identity policies have conflicted with sex-based protections, affecting areas like women's sports, female-only spaces, and LGB rights. Critics argue that including gender identity in civil law has undermined sex-based protections, particularly for women and same-sex attracted individuals. Issues such as male participation in women's sports and access to female-only spaces has raised safety and fairness concerns. Many also feel that gender identity policies have blurred the definition of same-sex attraction, pressuring LGB individuals to accept fluid concepts of sex and gender. Iowa's decision may influence other states re-examining gender identity policies. This legislative shift highlights a growing national debate on whether civil laws should prioritize sex or gender identity. As legal frameworks evolve, the push for clear, reinforceable sex-based protection is gaining momentum, challenging the direction of gender identity policies in the U.S. Now to Jose.
Thanks, Scott. Hundreds of protesters gathered outside the Maine State House in Augusta on Saturday for the March Against Mills, demanding that Governor Janet Mills and state politicians take action to protect women's sports. The rally was fueled by ongoing controversy over trans-identified male athletes' participation in girls' competition, an issue that has drawn national attention. Tensions escalated last month when a trans-identified male high school athlete took the first place in a girls' B-class pole vault at the state championships, which we previously reported on. The debate intensified further after Democrat House Majority Leader Matt Moonen censored Republican Representative Laurel Libby for sharing publicly available photos showing the athlete competing one year as male and the next year as female. In response, the Democrat-controlled House voted along party lines to strip Libby of her voting and speaking privileges in the legislature. After the censor, Libby joined X, quickly amassing over 50,000 followers, surpassing Governor Mills' audience on the platform within days. The controversy has also led to multiple Title IX investigations into the Maine Department of Education, Maine School Administrative District 51, and the University of Maine. Meanwhile, the Maine Principals Association, which oversees high school sports in the state, reaffirmed its commitment to allowing, quote, transgender female athletes, unquote, to compete, citing the Maine Human Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination based on gender identity. However, the federal government has now stepped in. The U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights announced an investigation into Maine's policies, stating that allowing male athletes to compete in girls' interscholastic sports could violate federal anti-discrimination laws. Acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Craig Traynor, emphasized that the state laws do not override federal Title IX protections. If Maine refuses to comply, the state could lose over $250 million in federal education funding, according to Representative Libby. Saturday's demonstration coincided with the first day of Women's History Month, a fitting backdrop to a debate that, according to multiple recent polls, most Americans see as a matter of fairness and fundamental violation of women's and girls' rights. On that note, I want to commend Representative Laurel Libby for her courage in speaking out. The video of her refusing to apologize to the Maine House for speaking the truth really struck me. It's clear that this is not about a Facebook post. It's about female athletes being pushed aside, told to stay silent, and expected to accept losing their place on the podium to male competitors. Now moving on to news from Washington State. Consumer protection advocate and LGB defender Glenna Goldis has published an op-ed scrutinizing youth gender medicine in Washington State. In her piece, Goldis argues that testimonies from parents, rather than providing the necessity of these treatments, instead reveal misinformation of potential fraud within gender clinics. In February, parents in Washington submitted 38 reports to Attorney General Nick Brown, expressing concern over Donald Trump's executive order restricting youth gender medicine. Many of these parents asserted that supporting their children's gender identities, including providing puberty blockers and hormones, was crucial for their mental health. Some feared that without access to such treatments, their children's well-being would deteriorate. Goldis, however, challenges the legitimacy of these claims, pointing to a pattern of misinformation among parents and misleading statements from medical practitioners. Some of their testimonies include one parent, SS, who writes of their child, a male placed on puberty blockers at age 11, quote, all the medical care that LS currently receives is reversible. She also started low-dose estrogen at the age of 13 years, after fertility counseling and preservation. Goldis challenges this assertion, noting that estrogen causes irreversible breast growth and that puberty blockers followed by estrogen treatment can lead to infertility and permanent sexual dysfunction. She also questions the validity of fertility preservation methods for prepubescent children. She also notes how some parental statements suggest deeper issues. One mother refers to her 11-year-old as her, quote, spiritual leader, unquote, while another recalls a gender doctor allowing an 8-year-old to, quote, steer the ship in decision-making, unquote. Additionally, several children in these cases exhibit symptoms associated with other mental health conditions, including persistent rumination on their gender identity and becoming dysregulated and shutting down when interacting with adults who don't recognize their identity or quote-unquote misgender them. Another mother, KCC, shares that her non-binary child was distressed seeing their friends go through puberty, leading to family to follow medical advice to use blockers. Quote, they needed to press pause while they figured everything out, unquote. The child is now 14 and still on blockers. Goldis questions whether indefinite puberty suppression is a viable solution, emphasizing that puberty is a natural and inevitable process. A Seattle pediatrician, GM, explains the rationale for blockers is to give kids, quote, the time and space to decide which outward gender characteristics are most aligned with their gender identity, unquote. But Goldis criticizes this approach, arguing that gender medicine lacks a logical foundation. She says, quote, If maleness is just a construct detached from biology, then what makes a beard masculine? Unquote. Despite these concerns, Attorney General Brown is using parental testimonies to challenge Trump's order, arguing that restrictions on gender-affirming care endanger transgender youth. He is joined in this legal effort by attorneys general from Colorado, Minnesota, and Oregon. Their case relies on guidelines from WPATH, an organization now facing increased scrutiny over its standards and decision-making processes. As Glenna says, suing the president may be thrilling for state attorneys general, but their primary focus should be consumer protection. If Attorney General Brown refocuses on this core responsibility, he might find a significant case to pursue, one that doesn't involve Trump. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Joss.
Thanks, Jose. Today, I'm starting with a study titled Examining Gender-Specific Mental Health Risks After Gender-Affirming Surgery. This is a national database study which analyzed the outcomes of 107,583 patients. The analysis showed that patients undergoing surgery were at significantly higher risks for depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and substance use disorders than those without surgery. The study excluded patients with documented pre-existing mental health diagnoses, so these results reflect new or emergent conditions rather than documenting pre-existing disorders. The study concluded that, quote, gender-affirming surgery, while beneficial in affirming gender identity, is associated with increased risk of mental health issues, end quote. Colin Wright on X states, despite these findings, rather than questioning the medical legitimacy of performing quote-unquote gender-affirming surgeries, given the significantly worse mental health outcomes among recipients, the authors instead suggest that these individuals simply require more post-surgical, quote, gender-sensitive mental health support, end quote. This new study comes on the heels of an as-yet unpublished puberty blocker study conducted by Dr. Johanna Olson-Kennedy that we reported on last fall. Allegedly, the notorious gender doc declined to publish the study, which followed youth taking puberty blockers for 2 years because the results did not show any improvements for the children, and Dr. Olson-Kennedy did not want her work to be quote-unquote weaponized. The study cost taxpayers $9.7 million. Worth noting is that Olson-Kennedy is being sued by Kea Clementine Breen. According to the Washington Times, Ms. Breen's medical negligence complaint says Dr. Olson-Kennedy affirmed the girl's transgender identity within minutes of meeting her, put her on puberty blockers at age 12 and testosterone at 13, and then referred her for a double mastectomy. The lawsuit reads, quote, she represented that if Clementine got a double mastectomy at an early age, the healing process would be easier, and that if she waited any longer, it would be impossible to do right, end quote. The lawsuit alleges that when Clementine's parents objected, Dr. Olson-Kennedy asked if they would rather have a living son or a dead daughter, even though the girl had not experienced or expressed any suicidal thoughts. The lawsuit was filed December 5th, 2024 in California Superior Court in Los Angeles. Moving now to the US Senate. Let's first begin with some information about filibusters. From senate.gov, the Senate tradition of unlimited debate has allowed for the use of the filibuster, a loosely defined term for action designed to prolong debate and delay or prevent a vote on a bill, resolution, amendment, or other debatable question. Prior to 1917, the Senate rules did not provide for a way to end debate and force a vote on a measure. That year, the Senate adopted a rule to allow a 2/3 majority to end a filibuster, a procedure known as a cloture. In 1975, the number of senators required for cloture was reduced to 3/5 or 60 of the 100-member Senate. In January, Senator Tommy Tuberville, a Republican from Alabama, introduced S.9, Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act of 2025, to the Senate floor, and it was placed on the Senate legislative calendar. In seeking a cloture motion so the vote could move forward, Tuberville said of males competing in the female category, quote, 67% of Democrat colleagues, their constituents say, no way, Jose, this is not going to happen. So to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you may want to check with your constituents before you make this vote today, because if polling is even close to correct, 8 out of 10 of your voters do not want men participating against women, end quote. Of course, what Tuberville was referencing was not just the recent polling, but the years-long trend in polling, showing that a majority of Americans, including Democrats, believe sports should be sex segregated. So why then would Democrats stalwart on this issue and vote against their constituents' wishes? Please share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think our elected officials operate? Do they govern on a fearless quest to meet the needs of their constituents, or is it a puppet show where their strings are pulled and they are de facto forced to toe the party line? Further, does their flexibility to say one thing and do another give you more or less trust in their ability to lead? For example, Representative Seth Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts, told the Times in a post-election story, quote, "Democrats spend way too much time trying to not offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete, but as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that," end quote. And yet, he still voted against the House version of the bill twice, even with his personal stake in the issue and all the polling showing his constituency believes sports should be sex segregated. Time and time again, when we hear people stand up to give testimony in front of legislators, speak at events, or speak out on social media in favor of single-sex spaces, single-sex prisons, single-sex sports, and for the rights of women, girls, and LGB people, they begin by saying something like, "My name is Joss. I'm a lifelong Democrat and progressive voter. I, of course, also mentioned that I'm a lesbian." Opening with these things is important to make plain that Democrats will fearlessly stand up for our own best interests and that we aren't forced to toe the party line, and that as progressive voters, the most progressive thing we can do is to vote for parity between the sexes, not vote for regressive sex stereotypes mistaken as gender identities. So Moulton and other elected Democrats secretly admit that they agree with their base and still vote against our interests and their own. I'll leave you with this quote from New Jersey State Senator Paul Sarlo, a Democrat. Quote, "It's very simple. Males should not be participating in women's sports, whether it's at the rec level, the high school level, or the collegiate level," he said. "I think if we just talked a little bit more straight up and had a little more practical common sense, we could have done much better at the polls. Elections have consequences," end quote. And now I'll hand it over to you, Arianne.
Thank you, Joss. I'm going to start with the news from Canada. On March 4th and 5th, a trial took place for Nicholas Mateer, that is Matear, a man accused of punching a 53-year-old mother and women's rights advocate named Tatiana while she was protesting in favor of parents' rights in front of the City Hall of Nanaimo, that is a city on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. The blog for the group Radical Feminists of Canada offers background on this case. According to the blog article, the rally and assault took place on October 2023 when Tatiana was holding a sign that read, "Get the cult out of schools," a reference to gender ideology being taught in schools. There were also counter-protesters, including 33-year-old Nicholas Mateer. At one point, Mateer shoved his "No place for hate" sign in Tatiana's face. After temporarily retreating, Tatiana found a quiet spot and held up her sign again. And that's when Mateer really gets aggressive. Now, I'm going to offer quotes of what Tatiana recalled from the attack in the Radical Feminists of Canada blog. Quote, "He walks right up to me and puts his sign back in my face. The sign is about a foot away from my face. I lift my hand and grab his sign, then pull it down. In one motion, as I pull the sign away from my face, his fist comes pummeling in. His punch sent me all the way to the curb. I flew more than the width of a car and landed partly on the sidewalk. My body twists and flies backwards, and I land face down, half in the gutter, with my head and arms on the sidewalk." Unquote. On the UVic Women X account, that is UVic Women spelled UVICWOMYN, offered coverage of the trial as it was going on March 4th and 5th. UVic Women, by the way, is a group that started in protest of the University of Victoria's Women's Center and their decision to admit men Here's a rundown of what they reported. Several witnesses to the attack were called on the first day, including 5 civilians and 2 constables. 4 of the civilians witnessed the punch, including a few who were on Mateer's side with the counter-protesters, as well as a bystander. Another witness had a video taken shortly after the assault. One constable witness was responsible for arresting Mateer, while another spoke to Tatiana and got her medical release. On March 5th, the second day of the trial, Mateer surprised everyone by taking to the stand and offering his own testimony, during which he admitted to punching Tatiana. His only excuse was feeling overwhelmed and afraid. That's a pretty pathetic excuse, given that Tatiana was much older and smaller than he is. UVic women said that they will be back sometime after April 1st for the decision, though I must say it already isn't looking good for Mateer's defense. I'll also note that some supporters of Tatiana came to the trial while it was going on. I have met Tatiana personally last year, and I'll say now on behalf of LGB Alliance USA that Tatiana, we support you and hope you receive justice. Also, hat tip to Radical Feminists of Canada and UVic women for reporting on this case. Now we turn to the gender kerfuffle at the Archimedes Banya, San Francisco's only full nude Russian bathhouse. The controversy arose when Archimedes Banya, which is normally co-ed, decided to exclude trans-identifying males from its monthly women's-only night. After receiving pushback, it decided to create another monthly night for women that does allow men who identify as women. In other words, it announced that it's setting aside 2 nights a month, one for biological women only, and another one for people who identify as women. The spy called the biological female night the Cultural and Religious Women's Night, in respect for the women whose cultural and religious backgrounds required them to have a, quote, female-only environment based on sex assigned at birth, unquote. This, of course, did not satisfy all trans rights advocates who thought any women's event that excludes so-called trans women or trans-identified males is unfair and bigoted. This story was reported on KPIX, CBS News Bay Area, which interviewed some of the trans-identifying people protesting the bathhouse. It should be noted that not all trans-identifying people were outraged at Archimedes Banya's policy. In a March 4th article in the San Francisco Standard, a trans-identified individual called Amanil McKay told the Standard, quote, "I think that cis women having their own day isn't that bad," unquote, as well as, quote, "No sane person goes to the Banya every day of the month," unquote. This is one example of the divide we sometimes see between ordinary trans-identifying individuals and the extremist activists who claim to represent them. And closing out California's news, California Governor Gavin Newsom surprised many with the trans activist unfriendly remark about women's sports on the March 5th debut of his podcast called This is Gavin Newsom. In the episode, which featured a discussion with right-wing pundit Charlie Kirk, Newsom admitted that he agrees with Kirk that it's unfair to allow those born male to compete on women and girls sports teams. At the same time, Newsom softened his stance by reminding Kirk about the high rates of suicide, anxiety, and depression among those who identify as trans, and Newsom expressed dislike for people who talk down to such people. He said it's possible to hold both views, presumably opposing trans-identifying males on women's sports teams while also not disrespecting them. Newsom's remark predictably provoked a firestorm of commentary. Democratic State Senator Scott Wiener, one of the biggest cheerleaders for gender ideology in the California legislature, issued a statement on his website denouncing the governor's comments. He praised Democrats in the U.S. Senate for killing the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act and went on to say, quote, "The governor has had many courageous moments over the decades supporting LGBTQ people, including helping turbocharge the marriage equality movement, protecting LGBTQ kids from forced outing and criminalization, and protecting trans people from criminalization in other states. He has taken significant political hits for doing so." I and so many will be forever grateful for that courage. This is not one of those moments. Charlie Kirk is a vile bigot, and standing with him on this issue is profoundly disturbing." Unquote. On the other hand, some anti-gender ideology activists don't think Newsom's remarks went far enough, pointing out that he was responsible for approving legislation in California that allowed trans-identifying males into women's prisons. For example, incarcerated women's advocate Amy Ichikawa wrote on X, quote, "It is deeply unfair. You know what else is unfair? Allowing men convicted of rape, convicted of murdering other men in men's prisons to transfer into women's general population by claiming a trans identity. This is also unfair. When are we going to ask if incarcerated women's lives matter at all? Is it not being asked because we already know the answer is no?" Unquote. There is much discussion about how sincere or major Governor Newsom's comments are. Is this merely rhetorical equivocation in order to appear fair to both sides? Or is this a genuine crack in the Democratic politicians' consensus in favor of the most extreme claims of trans rights advocates? Many observers have speculated that Governor Newsom is eyeing a run at the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 2028. Any statement he makes should be seen in light of his political ambitions. So let's pay attention and see if the governor doubles down, backtracks, or ignores what he said on his podcast, because it could be very important in determining the direction of the Democratic Party on gender. So turning it all over to you guys, what do you think of this? Do you think this is big? Do you think this is small? What do you think is going on?
I think cracks are beginning to show. Um, these these people standing up, like the governor standing up and saying common sense things, it's happening more and more. And I hope it continues. I mean, Iowa passing, Iowa saying it's really about sex-based rights, and the governor now saying this. I think I think there is a momentum here, and I have an idea. I have a belief that I'm not 100% sure that the Democratic Party is going to be able to hold this line much longer.
I hope you're right. I agree with you, Scott, and I hope that you're right because it bears out in the polling. It bears out with the people. It is something like upwards of 80% of all Americans, but 67% of Dems is a lot of people to want single-sex spaces, single-sex sports, single-sex, like across the board. So it doesn't make sense for the Dems to continue to vote against our interests as their constituency in their own. I'd almost included a commentary about Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar and Tammy Baldwin, specifically as strong women leaders who went along with this. And I started getting emotional. So I was like, I can't write that in because I don't want to get emotional in this news segment. But they're voting against their own interests. They are strong women leaders, and they've made a mark for themselves as strong female leaders, and they need to honor other women and protect them. So I'm really disappointed with all of them, all of the Democrats, but especially those three women.
Yeah, and I have to say too, when the Protection of Women and Girls Sports Act failed, I was really despairing. I couldn't shut up with some of my friends about it because I didn't, this was probably my being naive, but I couldn't imagine the Democrats as being so petty that they take it to the filibuster level. That means now you have to have 60 votes in favor. And quite frankly, I don't see the Republicans being able to win a 60 vote majority. So I'm like, oh no, how are we gonna, how's any of this gonna work? Because some of Trump's executive orders could very well be struck down in the courts. Another Democratic president could just repeal those executive orders. We needed federal legislation. And I'm like, oh, it's not gonna happen. So when Governor Newsom came out with this statement on his podcast, even though it's just one little snippet of the interview, I have to admit, I was quite happy about that. I know beggars can't be choosers, so, but I just thought, even even something like that for a Democrat with some national ambition. And I think Newsom has a reputation for sort of being like his own guy who will do whatever he wants to get ahead. I'm thinking, okay, maybe this will finally be it. So I have that sliver of hope now.
Yeah, I think he's seeing like an opening in the market or a way for him to look different. And I hope he's seen the writing on the wall and the polls and know that, yeah, you might lose some part of the left, but you might gain a lot more moderates, and I think that's part of the calculation that he's making, especially if he has national ambitions. Regarding the Women in Sports Act, yeah, that was also disappointing. And seeing the Democrats wear pink, and then all this, everything they said about them being the party that supports women is just very cynical and infuriating.
I watched a YouTube video the other night about Congressman Cortez, and she was being interviewed by NPR. And the NPR interviewer asked her to sum up the Democrats with one word, and she said the word was resolved. And I thought that's not the right word. I thought the word should be fractured, because again, I think this is happening more and more. I used to say in this issue of gender identity, successes are one step forward, five steps back. But I really think we can start saying maybe it's two steps forward, four steps back, because like I think a lot of the news stories in today's episode is about how people are beginning to say, no, that's enough. And I'm encouraged, and I haven't been this encouraged in a while. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. It'll also be interesting to see if Democrats start waking up, as public opinion still is against many of these issues. They're eventually going to have to start thinking about reelection. They're eventually going to have to start thinking about bringing what they hear from their meetings with us back to Congress and the Senate. It's going to be very interesting very soon, I'm sure.
It's a point I think Glenna made that I think that part of the problem is that when Democrats come out against it, if you're like the first Democrat who comes out against it, the problem is you sort of end up embarrassing your colleagues. So being that first crack is hard because then there's this like awkward moment of like, you seem to be implicitly calling out all your colleagues as doing something really stupid this whole time. But I think I'm hopeful that once that crack has settled in, eventually it'll be more of a faster domino effect and it'll sort of catch on more, but we'll see.
I think the point that Scott made about reelection is really important. And that might be exact and what Jose said also about getting the moderate vote with Newsom, that maybe they are actually starting to see the writing on the wall. That maybe the election of Trump was the wake-up call that kind of pivoted this, because it was this was a self-own. Democrats self-owned, and when you have 67%, two-thirds of your voters, two-thirds of your constituency is saying, I'm not with this, and you go harder into it, and then you lose the presidency, that has to trigger something in the minds of these people. So it was surprising to me also that especially the strong women that I mentioned, senators, would not use this as an opportunity. Instead, they kind of just were like, oh, let the states decide. We need to have hands off, and the NCAA and the states need to decide this. That's nonsense. They act like the NCAA is some important body that needs to have more power. They need to have less power. The NCAA has way too much power as it is. So maybe it is actually like that turning point for some of these Dems who have ambitions. Then they know that this is not the right side of history, and it's not winning, and they want to win. So maybe this will move the needle for real. So I also am optimistic that Newsom's move here is for higher ambitions, and that this might be the writing on the wall that maybe Dems will start to pay attention and follow his lead.
To what you said, Arianne, about the cost of speaking out, I think it's Helen Joyce who talks about the importance of speaking out is that it lowers the cost of speaking out to the next person. And so I like to see this as the result of multiple people speaking out on this issue that finally made it possible for him to say, to break with the Democrats and the consensus on this. So it's probably a good sign. But also I wish he would have, instead of admitting that he was wrong or that the party's wrong or that it's unfair for women, I wish he would have maybe admitted it with women and campaigners within his own party who have been talking about this issue for so long, instead of just sort of admitting defeat to a right winger. I think it would have been smarter and it would have made him look more like pro women, you know?
No, I think that's an excellent point, Jose. Why, of all the opportunities to do this, did he do it with Charlie Kirk and not one of, because I know in California there have been lots of women who have been protesting and putting a lot of pressure on California and the California legislature and the governor to do things like this, and also not just talk to, say it to the women's advocates, but also then also bring up the prison thing, because that's been something that a lot of women's rights advocates are absolutely outraged about, and admitting he made a mistake on the prison issue. I think that would be a hugely important step in making amends. So yeah, there's definitely more he can do.
I want to add to what you said, Jose, about one voice leading to another voice and how important that is. I love that you brought that up and mentioned Helen Joy saying that, because it is important. That's why we are here, to add our voices to this, and why it's important that you, all of you in our audience, use your voice and lend your voice to this cause as well. Like, we just keep making it easier and easier. Especially if you're a Democrat, if you're a moderate, if you're a Republican, it doesn't matter your political affiliation, speak out and have those difficult conversations with your friends and your peer groups. Let's move the needle even further.
Thank you everyone for watching. We hope to see you again next week. Until later.